Beyond Economics and Back podcast is created by Lithuanian Free Market Institute.
Welcome to the Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast. This is our series on the Universal Basic Income, the UBI, which is a proposal, or one could say a utopian idea to give money to everyone regularly so that everybody's basic needs are met. And that's what we're going to discuss today. I am Ogminas Petronis, and my guest today is Father Ben Johnson. Whose father? My father. No, the thing is that Ben Johnson is a Christian Orthodox priest. He serves at Christ the Savior Orthodox Christian Church in Byesville, Ohio. He has previously worked as the executive editor of Acton Institute. Also, he used to work at a Christian news website called LifeSite News. And among other things, he's an author of 3 books, among many other of his intellectual pursuits. Father Ben, welcome.
Wonderful to be with you, Ogminas.
Before we begin dealing with the universal basic income, could you briefly tell our listeners what your books are about and what are your intellectual interests in general?
Sure. I wrote a book with a man named David Horowitz called The Party of Defeat, which was about the war in Iraq. And I wrote 2 books exploring the intersection between philanthropy and public policy, particularly with nonprofit organizations funding public policy initiatives.
Right. Okay. I guess that's very interesting, and that's also helpful for our topic today, right? Because we're going to do this little sort of mental experiment. So, do you have a position on the universal basic income? And what is your position?
I do. I'm against the idea of universal basic income. I think that it's a negative idea for several reasons. On a purely pragmatic level, there have been several tests, none of which have attained the goals for which they were established. More importantly, I believe that this would impact the image of God in mankind, that man was not meant in order to receive passive income, but instead we were created in the image of God in order to be creative, in order to work, in order to improve the environment around us with the natural materials God has given us, and to provide charity for those who truly are in a case of need. So I think that it would be a negative impact on all of those outcomes. Additionally, all of the economic data have shown that this would be a highly inefficient method in order to truly do what all of us agree on, which is to provide for those who are in need through no fault of their own.
Right. One thing I wanted to ask you about it is that when you explain to people that, yes, you explain to people what UBI is, and then you say that you are against it, I think they are likely to react in a way that they would think that you are trying to take a pretty nice thing away from them, that you're merely working for the interest of the very rich who do not want to share what they have with others and so on. What would be your reaction to that?
Right. The idea of the universal basic income is like a lot of utopian theories through time. In fact, some people trace it back literally to the book Utopia by Sir Thomas More, although I believe incorrectly. But the idea of the universal basic income, that everyone gets a check, no one has to work, and that this, although it would not be at usually not a very high level of income, but would be enough to sustain a family, for example, and keep them more or less out of poverty. That idea obviously is very appealing to a lot of people. Here in the United States during the pandemic, when many businesses were shut down, the government issued checks to everyone that were very popular at the time. However, not everyone was able to trace the lines that followed after that, where just about a year after the final check went out, we had record-breaking inflation of 9.1% here in the United States, something we hadn't seen in 40 years. That level was unheard of here because it has damaging effects. The laws of economics are not repealed due to the kind moral intentions of those who support the program. And ultimately, I think that we have to drill down into what the UBI would actually do and the way that mankind, in the way that he was created, the way that all human beings, male and female, were created, would be impacted by this program, which is often left out by everyone who is developing these proposals.
Let's get into this one aspect you have already mentioned. And before we go to other things, so you have also previously written about the experiments with the UBI, right? And it is generally claimed in various sources that people can find on the internet, and most sources, that most of these experiments show that people either do not work less, or even if they show that the people work less, the pro UBI side is going to say that is a good thing because mothers get to be more with their children and so on. People experience less stress, and less stress means better mental health, and so on and so on. Yeah, so you have taken some effort to go deeper into these experiments. Could you tell us what is the real picture behind all this?
Oh, my goodness. Thankfully, there have been experiments going back at least 50 years here in the United States. Of course, they stretch all over the world, everywhere from Finland to Kenya, all over the globe. People have attempted this in various experiments, some of them government experiments, some of them privately funded. The first one of which I'm familiar here in the United States, at any rate, took place in the 1970s. The pro-UBI coalition is somewhat interesting because it's so diverse in its membership. So you had Martin Luther King Jr., for example, who was calling for a very high UBI, sort of a social democratic view. And then Richard Nixon, who's often presented as a rock-ribbed social conservative. He was not particularly conservative, especially on economics, but in 1972, he came up with what he called the Family Assistance Plan, which would have a guaranteed income for a certain number of people to keep people out of poverty. It was more akin to, say, Milton Friedman's idea of a negative income tax. And so they had a couple of experiments in two cities in the United States, Seattle and Denver. They called it the Seattle Income Maintenance Experiment and the Denver Income Maintenance Experiment, or SIME and DIME, D-I-M-E for short. And part of the idea, as you say, this often people who support this say that it would cause people who are in precarious employment to move into some kind of training, to go back to university or to go to community college to get some kind of a training in order to get into a better position. That was part of what they were hoping for here. What they found was even when they offered a large amount of income aside from the guaranteed income for people who would take classes, they could only induce a majority of people to do it when they paid most of the tuition for them, for those who took part in this experiment. Many of the people who took part in university classes did not do so in order to find employment. They did so simply out of curiosity. They took classes that were interesting to them, that did not propel them into any better employment. They found that people who were in employment tended to move out, but people who were out did not tend to move in. And as you say, there were fewer hours worked. They found also that there was a side effect to this, which would be most concerning to someone in my profession, who's clergy and should be of great interest to the entire society, namely that divorce increased because there's a marriage penalty written into U.S. tax code that you would be taxed at a higher bracket if both members of the family had a larger income. They would have to count the guaranteed income for both members. However, if they were technically divorced but living in the same house, then they filed separately and they were in a lower tax bracket. So it had unintended consequences that were quite negative on the marriage front. But there have been several programs. All of them essentially have found the same thing. There was one in Ontario, which the government pulled the plug on in 2018, I believe it was. There was a lawsuit over it in 2019 trying to restore it. But they found that 3/4 of those who were in Ontario who participated in the UBI didn't begin any new training. Those who were unemployed were less likely to start new training than those who were already employed. And people who were employed, they were more likely to work less. People were far more likely to move out of employment than into employment. Similar situation in Finland. And there's actually a brand new study that just came out just days before we're recording this. It was released in late July. Two studies have come out. One of them is financed by Sam Altman, who, of course, is known in Silicon Valley. He took several measures. The data are actually still being released as we speak, so this is all somewhat fragmentary. But he found, for example, that there was no impact on physical health, which is something that people often say. If they had more money, they would go to healthcare facilities more. They'd be able to take care of things of this sort. Here in the United States, we don't have an NHS or a public healthcare program. We essentially have to finance it ourselves. It is quite costly the way that we do it, although I think it has advantages certainly over government-run programs. But he found no impact on that front whatsoever. Similarly, there was a study released just recently by NBER, the National Bureau for Economic Research, looking at two different programs in two states. And they found, again, the exact same thing. It was a 2% decrease in labor market participation. People generally worked about an hour and a half less than they normally would. Income outside of what they got from the UBI, earned income fell. And generally, they had more free time. The way that they used that free time, and this is across many different studies, but particularly this NBER paper that just came out the end of last month, the way that people use their free time is not in taking new training. It's not in developing new skills. It is not in volunteerism. It's primarily increasing leisure, and specifically the NBER study found it's increased screen time. So people who are not working essentially are scrolling, they're streaming, they are entertaining themselves, but they are not doing anything that would enhance the value that they provide to others. They are essentially walling themselves off and enjoying the time that they have, but not doing anything that would increase their benefit to society or to their family or to themselves.
Right. I also wanted to ask about like taking it from a bit different angle. We can also ask about how much of a generalization we can arrive to looking at the experiments, because, well, it could be a very flawed approach to it. But let me briefly explain what I mean. So, for example, people in an experiment, they know that they participate in an experiment. They are going to get free money, the UBI, for a limited amount of time. At most, it could be 2 years, but very often it's much shorter than that. It can be several months. And they know that they can't just drop out of the labor market, right? Because they will have to make money and work after the experiment is over. And almost nobody else around them gets money for free, so they kind of just won the lottery, right? And that must affect the results of the studies, don't you think? And maybe we shouldn't make too much of a positive prediction about how UBI works, because it seems that, like, generally there are specific initiatives for people not to drop out of the labor market when they're in an experiment that are not going to exist if we have a UBI and we know that it's going to be there for 40, 50 years, or for what we have remaining in our lives, right? Would you agree with that?
You're absolutely right. People realize that the impact of a UBI, that's an experimental pilot program, as has been tried in many places across the United States and around the world, would be temporary, and therefore they adjust the way that they act while they're on it and after they're gone. You can find this in some of the granular details that have been released in some of these studies, particularly one that just came out from St. Paul, Minnesota. This was trumpeted throughout the media as being incredibly successful. If you look at the way that people shift throughout, they recorded people multiple times during this study, first at the baseline when they were part of their intake as their program, and then at regular intervals and at the end of this 18-month program, I believe it was. One of the questions they would ask people is, are you able to handle a $400 emergency? If there were an emergency, suddenly you had to pay $400 for something, could you deal with it? The percentage of people who could handle an emergency costing $400 declined the last 6 months of the trial, which tells me that if you drill down into it, the most reasonable surmise that we can make of that is that people were saving money because they realized they were going to have these checks coming in. And as soon as the last 6 months of the program came along, they realized that they were no longer going to be able to put that money aside because it was not going to be coming in. So they actually began to shift into a post-UBI frame of mind. Interestingly, by the way, that study is fascinating, the one taking place in St. Paul. It is one of the very few that found any increase in employment. But it's if you look into the reason why, it makes a lot of sense. In all of these, there is generally a small shift upward in employment as the program ends, which we were, of course, discussing. That one in particular is often trumpeted as being a program that says UBI will increase employment. The reason being, if you look at when this took place, it took place from 2020 to 2022. So it began at the height of the lockdown when there were no jobs, and it simply tracks with the jobs coming back into existence. So it's something of a misnomer the way that that's being applied. But in many of these, yes, people shift their behavior at the end because they know it's short term. And it also sort of points to something else. These UBI experiments, to the extent that they do succeed because they aren't truly UBI. They are not truly universal. A small group of people live this way, usually highly chosen by certain criteria, usually within a certain percentage of the poverty level, for example, 300% or something like that. And they are highly chosen, sometimes tested against a control group, sometimes not, but they are not representative of society as a whole. They are able to succeed because the rest of society keeps on working as normal in order to create the wealth which they are taking. So this is not really representative even when they succeed. It's not truly universal, and that's the best thing that one can say about these programs.
Right. And one thing that I think we should think about is how people who do the experiments, who run these experiments, they probably understand that the results that they get, as you said, they depend on many other things, including like when the COVID ends and people start coming back to work, and then suddenly you have an increase in employment among the group of the experiment. Yeah, sure, you're going to have that. And well, the question comes to me. So if these people understand that the results of various experiments do not show that UBI actually increases employment or brings the results that they hope that UBI could bring, and they nevertheless choose to just go around and say, look, oh, the UBI increased employment. Oh, UBI is so good. It brought such positive results. I mean, isn't this a lesson that people who run these studies, they are ready to lie to themselves?
Certainly, this should be taken into consideration when people are trying to formulate a policy. The fact that results shift over time because people are rational actors and they realize these are short-term programs that are going to come to an end. And again, the fact that not everyone is impacted the way that they would be under a UBI that's truly universal, where everyone is shifting, where everyone is working less.
Right. But what I wanted to point out is that it is scary how people are ready to lie to themselves to just get the results that fit their political opinions, right? Going forward, do you think that there are other welfare programs that have been implemented that could be in one way or another compared to the UBI, and therefore maybe they could be more helpful to give us some prediction about the real outcomes of real UBI?
Oh, certainly. There are certain programs in the United States and around the world that have been implemented that are not means tested, that are truly universal. In the United States, for example, everyone who reaches the age of, it used to be 65, now it's 67, receives a Social Security check. In the UK, there's the NHS, for example, and many other nations have national healthcare systems that are available to everyone, irrespective of their income or background. And if you look at the way these programs are administered, typically, especially the healthcare programs, they have been quite negative, candidly, because everyone is eligible to receive them. Now, the healthcare program is somewhat different than a UBI because the amount that everyone receives would be standardized and universal under UBI, that everyone would receive. Generally, most of the proposals say $1,000 a month or something like that, but there would be a certain dollar amount that every citizen would receive. There are other programs, UBI programs, that are essentially a welfare program intended to replace the social assistance state, the social welfare programs. For example, Charles Murray, the brilliant libertarian economist and thinker, comes up with a proposal to replace all social assistance programs with a UBI, and that everyone would receive it, but it would be essentially graduated. If you receive a certain amount of money through earned income, then you'd receive a lower UBI. Milton Friedman, with a negative income tax, would bring everyone up to a certain level of income. But yes, universal programs are always a hot button issue. And I think that in some cases, they lead to greater social strife because everyone is arguing over them politically. In the United States, for example, those proposals that Murray and others have made that would replace the welfare system are one way of going about UBI. On the other hand, Bernie Sanders, United States Senator who's a Democratic Socialist, ran for president at least twice in the last few years, has a large following around the world, sort of like a Jeremy Corbyn figure for the United States.
I think in Lithuania, we know who Bernie Sanders is as well. So people around the world do know, right?
Oh, good. So yeah, Bernie Sanders, during the height of COVID, recommended that everyone receive $2,000 a month in addition to Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, college for all. So this would be added on. And the idea that this would not become a political football where one side constantly accuses the other of austerity or hating the poor because they don't want perpetual increases, I believe is naive. So I believe that this would increase political strife, obviously would have long-term economic consequences. We saw the inflation over just a couple of checks, 3 checks in the United States, which the entire combined cost of those 3 COVID checks came to $816 billion, according to the Pandemic Oversight Board in the US government. That's approximately 1/3 of what a UBI would cost in the United States for 1 year. I believe that there would be a lot of unforeseen outcomes. We heard about the divorce ratio increasing in the Denver and Seattle programs in the 1970s. Similarly, I could see, for example, a lot of young people, if you had, say, a $10,000 a year program, as many of these are being proposed, I could see 3 or 4 young people deciding to pool their money and live together. And $10,000 would not be sufficient for any one person to do it, but 3 or 4 could live fairly comfortably on $10,000 a year at a rate that an 18-year-old would consider comfortable for some time, which would effectively hit the pause button on their personal development. They would decide then not to go to university, not to better themselves, essentially to have a 4-year college party without the college university degree at the end, and the life pathway leading to personal development and a greater future for themselves and others.
Okay, I want to turn this to another topic. So you're a Christian priest, and there's one thing that I want to specifically ask you because of that. So there are some very, very vocal Christians arguing for the UBI, and they often make theological arguments. And one example is Malcolm Torrey. He is an Anglican minister, and he has written a book that's basically called UBI, a Christian social policy. And what he argues is that UBI would help the poor. Unlike many current welfare programs, UBI would not discriminate, so it would not judge. It would give people the opportunity to choose what to spend money on. And yes, we are told not to judge by Jesus Christ. Also, God gives us grace that we haven't deserved. And so we should give grace to people who have not deserved it either. We could give this grace in the form of cash. As a Christian priest, what do you think about it? Is there any argument in this?
I'm always somewhat concerned when people invoke theological arguments for political ends. And this is one of the most concerning that I find. There have been many, many theologians, not just Malcolm Torrey, but many bishops, for example, in the Anglican Church of Canada, many Roman Catholic theologians and others, including reference from Pope Francis on Easter of 2020 in a letter that he sent. People who are arguing for a universal basic income, their theological arguments are tantalizingly imprecise, shall we say. There is not generally any underlying theological principle or ethical or moral idea from Jesus Christ saying that the government should give money to everyone. Jesus did not say, sell all you have and give to the rich. But under UBI, a government check would go to Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, to Jeff Bezos, the most wealthy people. Because it is universal, it would by definition not go to the poor exclusively, but to everyone, including those who had absolutely no need for it. So theologically, there is no reason for it whatsoever. And I disagree with Malcolm Torrey specifically for that. He essentially set up himself on the horns of a dilemma. Either you can help the poor or you can give money to everyone, but those are two separate and distinct aims, one of which is supported by the gospel to help the poor, not necessarily through government means, but Jesus Christ was not instructing the government. He was instructing the church to give of its own wealth and resources. Every one of us individually is to give to the poor, not to compel others to do so through government programs. There is not a single shred of that in the gospel, but instead for every one of us to give sacrificially to those who were around us. So I find that far less than persuasive. In fact, I believe that UBI goes counter to the instructions of the gospel on at least three different cases, one of which is the nature of mankind in and of himself, that we were created to work. Secondly, that there is a gospel command for us to work if we want to eat. And third of all, that work was instituted in order for us to give to others, particularly for those who are poor, for us to generate the wealth which we can then give to others instead of consuming for ourselves. So in the very beginning, when mankind was created by the hand of God in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15 speaks about how mankind was created, placed in the Garden of Eden. And the verse says, and the Lord God took the man, that is Adam, and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. So in other words, work is not something that came after the fall. We often think of that because in the next chapter, God says that in the sweat of thy brow, thou shalt bring forth thy food. So in other words, you would work and would cause a great deal of suffering. The suffering is because of the fall, not the work. The work is an intrinsic part of our created order. We were created in order to take the natural resources that God gave us, improve them, and offer them back to him in the image of God that is preserved in our fellow man. So any UBI program that would cause people not to work, to spend more time scrolling, to spend more time streaming, interferes with that underlying impulse that God has given to each and every one of us. Secondly, the idea that everyone would have a UBI and therefore it would alleviate those who are unwilling to work. That's concerning to me. It's one thing for those who are unable to work. The gospel speaks particularly of aiding those who the Apostle Paul says are, quote, widows indeed. That is, those who have no means of support. In the old world, there was no Social Security, no social assistance. Simply, if you had no one in your family to support you, you were going to, and you were infirm, elderly, or young and an orphan, you had no one to provide for you, for your needs, and they would not be met unless you found the kindness of strangers. The church was called on in order to care for those people. Everyone else, though, both the Bible and early Christian literature, my own Eastern Orthodox religious traditions, very steeped in this all the way through the last 2,000 years in an unbroken chain of documents, writings, and patristic and saintly statements, tell us that if people wish to eat and they are able-bodied, they should work. That comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 from the Apostle Paul. If a man will not work, neither shall he eat. But simply put, in order for us to actualize that potential, that creative potential that God places within us, God understands that we have a commandment which lifts us upward, which tells us what we are to do. But God also understands mankind's nature so much that we will do everything that we can to avoid doing anything that we have to, unless there is a negative consequence as well. And so hunger pains are of that consequence. I'm reminded William F. Buckley Jr. was in a debate, firing line debate many years ago with someone who was arguing for social democracy state. And they asked him, how will you assure that people eat? And he says, well, you have an appetite for one. So the fact that we have an appetite assures that we will do what we need to do in order to fulfill that, if we are not hindered from doing so by other programs. And when we do that, then according to the teachings of the church, and both my church, your church, and most of Protestantism throughout all of the ages, when we engage in work, we are developing our skills, we are actualizing our talents, and we are doing so for the service of others. And in a free market economy, we offer our services that people are willing to pay for, which means that they value what we're doing. Profit is a sort of a tangible payoff, showing that they value the work that we offer them. So that's highly important. And these go back all the way literally to the earliest documents outside of the Bible. The Didache, for example, says that if a brother comes to you, he's a Christian, and he will stay with you 2 or 3 days, put him up. But if he wants to stay long term and he's able to work but won't, put him out. The translation in English says he is a Christmonger, which is a wonderful phrase I've not heard before, but someone who is selling his faith in Christ in order to get charitable donations. The same thing in the Apostolic Constitutions, which was written about 380 AD. They say that every one of us has to work. And this is true, as we said, it was an Edenic quality that Adam and Eve were working. But it's also true of what the Eastern Orthodox Church would call the heavenly life, which is in the monastic tradition. In the work of the Desert Fathers, there's a life of St. John the Dwarf. That's his name, in the life of the early Desert Fathers, probably about 4th, 5th century. And I believe he was an Ethiopian saint, as I recall, but he decided at one point he was living in a cell with another monk, and he said, I want to live a truly angelic life, and angels don't work. So I'm going to go out into the desert. I'm going to leave my cell with you, go out by myself, and praise God continually. And he left for about a week. And presumably at that time, the hunger pains began to kick in. He came back to his cell and knocked on the door. And his former cellmate said, who is it? He said, it's John. And he said, no, John's not here. He's become an angel. So it can't be John. So he left him overnight, and he opened up the door the next day and he said, you can come in, but if you want to eat, you have to work. And John, the dwarf, St. John, said, forgive me. So he realized that even in the monastic state, work is necessary. It's part of God's order, part of his creation for us. And we do this in order that we have an abundance of wealth generation, not for ourselves, but so that we can give to those who are unable to work, unable to support themselves, either through physical or mental infirmity, or for those who are in, for example, addiction, who are not able to work at this stage in their life, whom we can give a hand up. But even charity in the Old Testament involved a great deal of work. There was a process if someone was passing through an area or didn't have any money, and even Jesus' disciples engaged in this, was called gleaning. There were laws in the Torah which said that if you were to plant a field or have an olive branch or something like that, whenever you were planting this, when you came up with a harvest, you left some of it behind. So when the poor passed through, they could harvest and eat on their way, or if they didn't have anything else, they could come and harvest. Now, harvesting is hard enough when you have all the tools at your disposal. If you're just someone who's passing through, elderly, infirm, it's even harder. So essentially, this is a form of workfare that Christ used, even for those who were truly in need. So that's the idea that we would simply exempt people from working and have them consume mindlessly entertainment, which in many cases we can certainly say does not benefit their spiritual development. The Kardashians are not good for the soul, we can say definitively. That to me is highly concerning, and it would have a negative ramification in addition to all the economic ramifications that would have high inflation, every other trouble that would certainly come about, lower productivity. You would have fewer resources, fewer people willing to work, fewer people generating wealth. When you have more money and fewer goods, that's the definition of inflation.
All right. I guess we are approaching the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for it. This has been truly, truly interesting. And this has been Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast, Beyond Economics and Back. My name is Ognas Petronis. My guest today has been Father Ben Johnson. Thank you, Father Ben.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's always a joy to be able to speak with you, and thank you for all the good work that you're doing at LFMI.
And goodbye.